All right. So yeah, today I just want to talk a little bit about quoting and paraphrasing. Next week, we're going to talk specifically about quote integration and how we effectively use writers' ideas in our essays, right? But this is the move that we're going to be making from here on out. I think this is probably like the most, I don't know if there is a most important move that comes out from English one. This is like one of the most, I don't know if there's like one most important move, but being able to like take a writer's ideas and synthesize those ideas or like connect that writer's ideas to your ideas is a really big move to be making for the class, right? Like this is from here on out what we're going to be doing in every essay that we write. The first essay that we wrote, was narrative, right? Like had a lot of like your personal story connected to things that were important to you. Every essay from here on out, you're going to have to use outside sources, which are the texts that we read over the course of the unit, or texts that you find like when we're doing our research paper at the end of the semester. So from here on out, like we're building our essay with other people's ideas to help support the claims that we're making. Okay, so I don't know, some ideas that you have. I know there's only a couple of people in here, but what are some of the reasons that we use outside sources in our writing? Like anyone have an idea of why you would want to use outside sources in your essay?
To bring credibility to your writing.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So it could definitely bring credibility, right? It can make you sound, it's one of those things like you hear people like reference research or, reference a lot of times people in positions of expertise. Like it makes your argument more credible if you're referencing someone. Sure. What else?
To get outside opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like that's a really good point. Like to hear somebody else's opinion. And sometimes that opinion can be one that's similar to yours, right? But other times we can counter people. So like using a source in an essay doesn't just mean that somebody is presenting an idea that you agree with, right? Like that there can be like, here's what some people would argue, or here's this person's argument. However, here's what I believe to be true about this, right? Or maybe vice versa. And so sometimes like it can be somebody else's opinion that fortifies or supports your point and gives your idea credibility, or it could be somebody else's opinion that maybe you contrast or that your opinion differs with that idea. So here's different reasons why we might do this. And the top two are the two that you brought up, right? Outside sources provide additional perspective, right? Like that difference of opinion, similar opinion, but maybe a different perspective on that opinion. They can be used to affirm your point, right? That's that idea of like gives you credibility or like kind of fortifies an idea that you're presenting, right? It's like, I don't know, sometimes like I think about that, like if there's an idea that I have and then I hear somebody who's like a credible authority on that idea say something similar, I'm like, ooh, that was a good idea that I had. It makes me feel like a little bit prouder about the idea that I had because I heard somebody in a position of expertise make that point, right? So it can like affirm an idea that you're making. You can contrast ideas, right? Like that could be like a counter argument. So like, I think that's a really important point to explore that we're going to be doing over the course of the semester is that like you are able to present a more critical argument when you look at the opposite side of something, right? It's one thing to only be willing to see your side of an argument. It becomes a much stronger and much more critical argument to be able to acknowledge that, yes, there is an opposing view. Here it is, but here's why the view that you're presenting is still the one that you think to be the strongest, right?
And I'll tell you, like, that's an easy place to get stuck when you find that kind of contrary idea to be like, oh man, this destroys what I was trying to say. But that can be a good thing. Like you can have your opinion in that and be like, well, this really complicates thing, and that's something I need to think about as well. Like that shows a really strong argument, in my opinion, if you're able to put in those pieces. So yeah, that's a great use of quotes.
Next is like I think about this idea of like outside sources that can present like popular thoughts on a topic or like a prevailing thought, right? Like a lot of times we think about maybe utilizing outside sources as a way to show that here's like the popular opinion on this issue, right? This can also be really helpful for like an introduction. Is like starting like with this idea of like, here's what most people believe to be true about this. Here's a quote, or here's some sort of research, or here's some sort of expert presenting this idea. It's kind of one of those moments where it'll get like everybody's head nodding, right? Kind of like bring you along on what the argument is. It can be helpful to do that. A lot of times we use outside sources to present research or present data, right? We hear that especially now, like every time that something comes out and there's some sort of, new development or new restriction, or, I just read last night that, for example, like they're presenting research and data on children ages 5 to 11 on the COVID vaccine, right? And so like, if I'm listening to somebody talk and they were to say, oh, it's now safe to get the COVID vaccine, or it's getting closer to being, accepted as safe to get this vaccine, they would say, for example, in this research, the CDC recommends blah, 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 and they would give the data to be able to back that up, right? And so a lot of times, like whenever we're using quotes, we can use them in a situation to help present research and data. And then that also informs your expertise, right? Like one of the things that becomes helpful, like, and you'll see this happen as you do your research papers this semester, is that you'll be put in positions of expertise, right? Like in the sense that the more of the outside research that you read and that you internalize, the more of an expert that you become on a topic, right? So like you start reading these things, using outside sources helps build your expertise. And then to Anthony's point, right, they add credibility, right? It's kind of one of those like, don't just take my word for it, listen to what these experts have to say, right? So as a writer, I think that's a really powerful move where you're like, this isn't just my idea. This is what experts in this specific area, or people who've not just maybe necessarily experts, like whatever degree they have relating to, whatever field or life experience they have relating to a field. But it could also be that it adds credibility because maybe somebody, from a specific community is presenting an idea. Maybe somebody who has a specific life experience is presenting an idea. So expertise comes in a lot of different, shapes and forms, right? It's not just like, for example, we're reading Trevor Noah's book. We could read something by a historian who studied South Africa during apartheid, and that's one type of expertise. Or we could read something written by somebody who's actually lived through it, and that's another type of expertise, right? So it can add credibility to our paper and to our arguments by utilizing people who are in positions to be able to make like strong arguments about whatever topic we're exploring. So, oops, there we go. It always wants to skip multiple times. So this is kind of an important idea, right? There are going to be times where we're going to be choosing, and we'll talk about like when it's appropriate to do one over the other. When we're selecting a part of a reading to either quote or to paraphrase, right? And that's one of the things that we're doing for homework this week is picking two ideas, two sections of reading and paraphrasing those. And so you want to make sure that when you're picking a section of a text to quote or a section of a text that you're going to paraphrase, that you want to pick something that has a lot of substance, but it's not overwhelming, right? It's not too big, but it's also not too small. I always think about that with like the perfect bite of food. Like most of the analogies that I explore in classes and that I'll talk about over the semester usually have to do with eating, right? But like, I think this one it works pretty well. And I always think about this one in the context of sushi. Like my favorite sushi places, like I like to be able to like take the one little piece of sushi and like pop the whole thing in my mouth so that I kind of get like all of the different things that are happening in the roll, right? If a piece of sushi is like too big, it's overwhelming and I can't do that. And I'd have like a giant mouthful of food and I'd be disgusting to eat lunch with, right? If the other way was it was too small, it would be underwhelming. Think about like too small of a bite of something. You're just like, it's not enough, right? It's not enough to like kind of sink your teeth in, so to speak. And so that idea is true of passages that we either want to quote in our writing or paraphrase in our writing. And what I mean by that is that like you want to make sure that you're grabbing something, collecting a writer's ideas that you can analyze and you can there's enough there to be able to do that. But what you don't want to do is try to quote or paraphrase like an entire paragraph or, I don't know, 7 or 8 sentences or even maybe 6 sentences. Like that might be too much. There might be too much going on there And it might be like that situation where like you're trying to take too big of a bite of food and it just becomes overwhelming. So I like to think about like usually finding that kind of like sweet spot. And it's one of those things of like, you know it when you see it, just kind of like taking a bite of food. Like you kind of know the right size bite as you're taking it. And I'll show you some examples that we'll look at. And this is kind of a skill that we'll practice over the course of the semester. But this idea of making sure that like we're picking something that we can analyze without it feeling overwhelming, or it feel underwhelming because there's not quite enough there to be able to like really use to build our argument. So what is the difference of quoting and paraphrasing? What does it mean to paraphrase and what does it mean to directly quote? So when we're quoting a writer, what are we doing?
We're taking their exact words.
Exactly, right. We're taking their exact words. And when we're paraphrasing, then what are we doing?
We're summarizing their words in our own words.
Exactly, right. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's great, right? So quoting, we're taking their exact words. Paraphrasing, we're taking their idea, but we're putting it into our own words. And so this is important that in both of these situations, the idea is not yours, right? You're taking somebody else's idea and either word for word, in quotation marks, putting a writer's ideas out there, or you're taking a writer's ideas, it's still that writer's idea, but you're putting it into your own words, right? And in either case, we want to make sure that we're giving that writer credit for their ideas. Sometimes you want to do one, sometimes you want to do the other. Sometimes it matters why you do one versus the other. Sometimes it really doesn't. It's just kind of a choice. There's no right or wrong answer. It's kind of all about context, right? It's kind of like thinking back that analogy of food is like, is there a right and wrong answer of like what I'm going to eat for lunch today? I mean, I guess that could be a wrong answer if I just went in there and like devoured a carton of ice cream. That's probably a wrong answer to what I should have, right? But there's not really like a necessarily like right and wrong. It's just kind of like context, like what do I have in the fridge? What did I eat yesterday? What do I feel like eating, right? It's all kind of like the situation sometimes helps me understand which one is I should be doing when.
I would say like when you're really looking at like the words, the exact quote that the person's saying, like use the exact quote. If you're kind of getting an idea of like an overall message that something is saying, like there's one paragraph in Born a Crime where he talks about like children are being taken from like mixed families and the blackjack show up and he has to be hidden away when those people show up, and that's like a huge chunk of text. But if all I want to talk about is like, hey, there was such an oppressive area that like he had to be hidden away, like that's something I can paraphrase. I don't have to give like the huge chunk of text there. I just need to give you the idea so I can go in the analysis of it.
Exactly, right. It's like it's kind of like, you know, just thinking about what those situations are where you would do it, right? Like, and I think about like quoting, like to Chris's point, there are situations where like the writer's words are going to work perfectly, right? That like a lot of times there's situations where like the writer has just said it best. And it's like, I can't change those words because the words are so good. I think about it as like when bands cover songs and you hear a cover of a song and you're like, you should never cover that song because that band did that song perfectly, right? And then a lot of times you hear that good, right? Then other times you hear covers of songs and it's like, oh, they made the song better. Like it sounds better, the remade version of it than the original version, right? And so like think about that with quoting, where like sometimes a writer is going to say something and they're going to say it so well that you're going to want to directly quote them. Like you can't change that. I can't write it any better, right? And I think that that's kind of one of those places where there's going to be moments when we see Trevor Noah do that, right? Like where he'll make these points and he'll present these ideas where it's like, I feel like no matter how hard I try, I can't write a better sentence than the way that he did it. So that's a great place to use a direct quote. And those are just personal. Those are up to you when you run across them. Sometimes you might hear something or read a line and be like, oh, that's really well written. Other times you might be like, I like the idea, but I want to put it in my own words. Next, sometimes the writer is going to be using vocabulary or introducing concepts that are difficult to paraphrase, right? But there are those situations where like the wording the writer uses, there's really not another way to phrase it. So you might want to directly quote in that situation. quoting is really effective for presenting research and data, right? Because kind of to Anthony's point about that idea of like credibility, if you're using a direct quote and like, here's the research, that can be really direct to your reader. Your reader will see that and be like, oh, this is written in like, in a way where I clearly see that it came from this research. It's written almost like in a scientific way. Like the way that we look at it is like, it's direct, it's in your face, right? Like, and it's like sometimes changing around that data or putting that data into your own words might lose the credibility that you're trying to gain by putting out direct research. And then it's effective to use quotes when presenting familiar or popular passages, right? Like there might be sections of something that you might not want to paraphrase because people know that passage is familiar or know that it's popular. So maybe think about like, I don't know, I think about that in situations like when I'm teaching a literature class, if we're using like Shakespeare, or if you're quoting maybe a famous politician, or you're quoting like a famous idea, it's like to change or to paraphrase that will lose the how recognizable the passage is that you're using, right? So like there's those quotes that we all know, that we've heard many times, that are familiar. And if I try to paraphrase some of those things, then I might lose that familiarity that I'm going for, right? And so that could be one of those places where you wouldn't want to do that. Paraphrasing, on the other hand, there could be places where the writer, the language, or excuse me, the language the writer is using is just overcomplicated, and you want to simplify it, right? Like there's situations where writers get too wordy, or writers use too much big language, and you could just be like, you know what, I want to change it around. I don't like how hard it is to get to this big idea, right? And so maybe kind of think about situations where you're reading something and you're like, it really takes some heavy lifting to get to these ideas, and I want to make it clear and easy for my reader to understand. Sometimes you can just say it better than the writer can, right? Like the writer has a great idea, but it's I don't know, too busy or it's too wordy, right? And you want to just like say, hey, you know what, I could be direct. It's kind of to Chris's point. Maybe the writer is presenting an idea, but it's taking them a long time to get to the idea. And you want to just make it quick and easy and direct and put it out there for your reader. Sometimes you want to make sure that the writer's idea is matching the tone and the language of your paper. So for example, there could be situations like if we go on to like some research, or like when we're reading Blind Spot this week, there can be some situations where the ideas the writer's presenting are being done in a very kind of verbose or big word kind of way, right? Where it's like, it feels very, I don't know, academic, for lack of a better word. There's that stuff I read where I'm like, oh, this feels different than the way that I talk. It feels different than the way that I write, right? And so there could be those situations, like I feel like when we're reading Trevor Noah's book, he writes in a way that I feel like is easy to follow along with, right? It feels like it's the way someone would talk. It's easy to follow along with his book. When you read Blind Spot this week, it might not feel that easy because they're writing and presenting some research on implicit bias. And so there might be places where you're like, oh, I want to change this wording around because it matches the rest of my paper. Sometimes that quote can feel like it comes out of nowhere with the way that your writing style is throughout your essay, or the vocabulary you're using, or something like that.
That's also something I think, like, both in this class and later classes, like a thing you got to think about is like, who's reading your paper and what audience are you like reading it to? Is it somebody that if you throw in like a quotation that's going to use like super complex ideas and phrases, like, is your audience going to be able to digest and understand that thing, or should you paraphrase for it? It's a really important thing to like get a grasp on when you're thinking about like, who am I writing this for and what's their understanding going to be of this?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that like too, with paraphrasing is really helpful for you, kind of like if you're writing it for somebody, but then also to help you internalize ideas, right? If I can read something and explain something to you in my own words of what I just read, then I own those ideas, right? Then it's like I was able to process. It's like that's like a big sign of reading comprehension, is that retell, right? Like read something and then tell me what you read. I can read something, I can pick up like behind me, a lot of these books up at the top are like my wife's books for nursing school. I could directly quote a ton of that stuff, right? I could open up a chapter and directly quote something about gastroenterology. It doesn't mean that I know anything about what I just said, right? I'm kind of like a parrot at that point. I'm just repeating what I read. But if I can read a chapter from that book and explain a concept to you, then I understand it, right? And so I think this is one of those places where like paraphrasing can be a helpful thing for you for reading comprehension, is to be like, I can explain this in my own words, and that means that I capture these ideas, that I own these. And then in other places, you might find multiple writers who are articulating the same point. And we'll practice this when we get closer to the research project, but it's like, you might find two people that are saying essentially the same thing in two different ways, and you want to paraphrase that and present two ideas in your own words, but say both of these writers said this. Like there's some places where like Trevor Noah and Chimamanda Adichie are kind of creating the same argument, right? And you could say like, here are both of these writers presenting this point, right? Or the chapter from Blind Spot by Banaji and Greenwald, like they're saying the same thing that Adichie is saying about what happens when we start to have biases around single stories, and you can present that same idea there and credit all of the writers by saying that. Okay, so here's some quick little different example. Like this is a great resource. I showed this at the beginning of the semester, but then there's another link to the OWL. But the OWL can really help with, you know, how to format for quotes and for paraphrases. And I'm just going to show you like a quick little example. For direct quotes, we want to make sure that we're using doing a couple things. One, and we're going to talk about this next week in some more detail, that we're going to be putting, all we'll talk about this week is this idea of like the in-text citation, right? So you'll do an in-text citation regardless of if you're doing a quote or a paraphrase. And the in-text citation is this little section where I have either the page number or the writer's names and the page number, right? In parentheses with the punctuation on the outside. So the period to end the sentence would be on the right-hand side of the last pair in there. The difference between whether I'm doing a direct quote or a paraphrase, the only difference will be is if I use the quotation marks or not. But I'm still going to do the in-text citation of the page number of where I took that idea from, right? Because it's not my idea. This helps the reader see that the idea that I'm presenting is not mine. So this is from Blind Spot. And there's two ways that I could have directly quoted this. One is if I could use the writer's name in the sentence, then when I get to the little parentheses with the page number, I don't have to put the writer's names there. The other example, the second one, same exact quote, but if I don't use the writer's name at the beginning of the sentence, then when I get to the little parenthetical section with the page number, I would put the writer's name in there, right? This is all on Purdue's OWL, but it's really, really straightforward. This just lets the reader know that this idea is not mine, right? The quotation marks tell you that. But then also, if that reader wanted to say, you know what, I would like to see where this came from, they could go to page 109 of Banaji and Greenwald, and there it would be, right? So again, next week, we're going to talk about this more in context of how we frame quotations, but this is the move that we're going to be starting to make, right? When it comes to MLA formatting our papers, we'll talk about how to write a works cited page, but then also to do these in-text citations. So like literally in our writing, I'm saying that I got this idea from these writers, and here's the page number that I got them from. And this is the type of stuff that we need to do to make sure that, like, you know, we let our reader know that we're using somebody else's ideas and that we're not plagiarizing. And, you know, in the syllabus, I talk about like plagiarizing. There's, I guess, kind of two different ways to think about it. One of them is kind of like, you know, is that direct like cheating version that I mentioned in my syllabus, right? Where it's like you take an essay and you try to present it as yours and it's not, right? Like there's websites where there's, you know, essays about whatever and stuff like that. And sometimes that happens, right? But usually it's just an honest mistake. It's just like, oh, I presented an idea in my paper and I didn't cite my sources correctly. And so that's one of the moves, like I'll never, you know, that's never a situation where I'll be upset if somebody's like, oh, I forgot to put my parenthetical page number. Like that's a move that we practice in this class, right? Is that making sure that we're citing our sources appropriately and we're giving writers credit for their ideas when we use them. And so this is just something that we'll continue to practice. And like, yes, technically, if we forget to do that or make a mistake and do that, that's plagiarism. but that's not the same thing. It's almost like that should have a different word. Like I just think about that as like, oh, you forgot to do this, to make this move, or you forgot to have your parenthetical page number. And that's a skill that we're going to practice over the course of the semester. So in this case, you would just see that we would just have the page number and the writer's name if we don't use it in a sentence. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Question. I tend to get asked this at least a couple times. What happens when you're quoting something that is quoting something? Like, what do you do in that situation? Do you just try to avoid it?
No, so then we could do quotes within quotes, right? So like, for example, if we're using, let's say we're reading Trevor Noah, and or actually a DJ does this, right? Like in a DJ's TED Talk, a DJ quotes other people, right? She gives different examples of people that she's read and says what they said. So that's where you would use like single quotation marks within the double quotation marks, right? And so like if Banaji and Greenwald were quoting somebody else, sometimes in their writing, they would use quotation marks. So you would have the Banaji and Greenwald quote, and then within there, you would have the quote that they have. I'll show some examples of that maybe next week when we're looking doing the mini lesson. I'll make a little note for myself, and I'll have like an actual example where I'll show you how to use a quote within a quote. But that's a really powerful move to use in your writing, because what you don't want to do is like to not use those, because a lot of times writers are referring to previous experts to be able to help make their ideas stronger. So it's kind of like you're saying, I'm using this writer who also used this writer to present my argument. It makes your idea really strong because you're using multiple sources in a way. Okay, so let's look at an example of something that
real quick.
we would. Oh yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
Which so in that example, and yeah, I was I hope to see some examples of that. But like just for thing I was trying to imagine it, who would I cite in that? Would I cite like a DG, or would I cite the person that she quoted?
You would cite a DJ.
Yeah,
because
Okay,
she's
cool.
your source.
Yeah, you cite whatever text or whatever thing you're looking at.
All right.
Yeah, I'll make a little note as soon as we're done that next week I'll show you some examples of what to do with quote within a quote. But you would cite whatever the source is that you have, because that's your source, right? Your source is referencing something else, but you wouldn't have to cite that thing also. It would just be like whatever the source is that I'm reading. So if we look at this passage, right? This is from Blind Spot, and Blind Spot, you know, I just posted the readings yesterday, right? So this is probably new, right? And so Blind Spot is about bias, right? And kind of understanding like where biases come from and how we can be, you know, either influenced by our bias if we're aware of it, or not even aware of it if there still has an influence. And so in this passage, Banaji and Greenwald, this is a direct quote that I pulled from the reading, right? And then we want to talk a little bit about like some strategies of how we would take this idea and paraphrase it, because this is a big idea that's happening here, but there's not, you know, maybe there's a clearer, more direct way that we could present this idea, right? So let's kind of talk about like how we would paraphrase this. Maybe we could use the chat as a place to like write a potential paraphrase when you think you might have one, right? There's no wrong to this. We're just going to kind of take a shot at paraphrasing this. So in this chapter, they're talking about kind of basically categorizing, right? And DJ talks about the same thing about how like when she sees people, she says the problem with single stories and stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but they only tell one story, and there's more than one story. And Banaji and Greenwald are kind of saying the same thing. They're saying something very similar to that idea about what happens when we categorize people, right? And so here's their quote. It says, the same mental abilities that allow us to perceive and categorize appropriately, that are necessary for us to learn and understand, and that makes us successful in detecting and recognizing, are also abilities that lead us astray. So again, The same mental abilities that allow us to perceive and categorize appropriately, that are necessary for us to learn and understand, and that make us successful at detecting and recognizing, are also the abilities that lead us astray. So if we were to take this passage, right, and then try to paraphrase this passage, one of the things that we might want to do is start breaking this up into little pieces, right? So we would ask ourselves, like, what is one of the ideas this passage is presenting? We know that it's focusing on mental abilities, right? We see that being used there. We also see, are there any other words that we see get repeated multiple times? Because there's mental abilities is used here. Then at the end, they talk about abilities being used there. Anything else that you think is like a key idea that has to be used in this paraphrase?
Perceive and understand are
Yeah, perceive and understand. That's right. Yeah, perceive. I also see this, I like kind of recognize, right? Like that's used again. So how would we kind of say, like in our own words, what do you think this passage is telling us? Like very generally, before we start putting a paraphrase together. Like if I start, I'm going to go into the chat just to make it easier so we can all see this. So we have mental abilities that help us do what?
Understand
Uh-huh.
things,
Yeah, and learn.
understand the world around us.
Okay, good. Okay, so we have mental abilities that help us understand the world around us by, what are we doing to help us understand the world around us? There's something that these writers say at the beginning of this sentence.
Perceiving and categorizing.
Perceiving and categorizing,
Yeah.
right? So what does categorize mean? What's another way of saying that? How would we put that idea into our own words?
Organize or make sense of.
Yeah, good. So there's the beginning of a paraphrase, right? We have mental abilities that help us understand the world around us by organizing maybe things or people, right? Maybe that's what they're talking about. Should I put things or people in this paraphrase? Should I put people here?
I don't think I would.
Why not? Good. Why shouldn't you?
Their idea is more broad than that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no mention of people, right? So this is one of those places where, even though I'm concluding that these writers are talking about people, a paraphrase never includes any of your own conclusion, right? A paraphrase, because let's say I read this quote and I start thinking about people. I'm like, oh, well, this must be related to people because, you know, it's about bias. And we just got done reading Adiche and she got done talking about single story. Your opinion or your conclusion comes later. We'll talk about that next week with this idea of analyzing a quote or analyzing a paraphrase. A paraphrase is purely, what did this writer say? In that section, it's just what is the writer's ideas. So in this case, I wouldn't say people. I would just say maybe we have mental abilities to help us understand the world around us by organizing, right? Is this helpful to have this?
Yeah, it looks like it's less words. That could be helpful if you're trying to get right to your point or condense
Yeah.
an idea.
And do we think that these writers, that Banaji and Greenwald, think these skills are helpful? That this idea of being able to categorize and perceive, do they think that that's a good thing to have?
I
It's
was thinking about it. Says necessary. I
Yeah,
feel like
that's
that's
what I was
important that they say these abilities are necessary for
Mhm.
Yeah.
understanding.
Right. So they help us, right? They're necessary. So we have that part so far, but do they think there's also something problematic or something wrong with these abilities?
Yes.
What can they do? Why, in your own words, based off of what you read here, it says, they say that they make us successful at detecting and recognizing are also the abilities that lead us astray. How would we put that in our own words? Any idea of how we would take this passage and put this into our own words? This last bit, these abilities, they are also the abilities that lead us astray.
Lead us to a wrong or different path.
Yeah, lead us to,
Yeah. That like in one way or another, it's deceiving us.
yeah, it can lead us to a wrong or different conclusion.
Yeah.
That these abilities can deceive us, right? Like there's so many different ways that we could paraphrase this. But this one that I just put in the chat, based off of that last idea that Sebastian just put there, this is saying the same exact thing these writers are saying. And notice even the paraphrase is using some of the same words, right? They're not all exactly the same, but there's some similar language there, right?
Yeah.
Like the tone still stays pretty much the same, but the writer's ideas are there, right? And basically, like what these writers are saying in this passage is the same thing that a DJ is talking about. Think about categorizing things, right? Think about creating biases. It's like, I don't know, in a much more lighthearted way than thinking about maybe they're talking about bias related to people, related to, a lot of times like you're going to look at, if you do one of the implicit bias tests, they talk about things related to race, skin color, gender. But if I think about this idea and I apply it to dogs, right? And it's just a simpler way to understand. When it comes to what dogs I'll pet and what dogs I won't pet, actually, I'll probably pet any dog, but let's say not. Let's say what dogs do they pet, what dogs do they not? Usually people perceive and categorize dogs, right? And that can be helpful. So if I see, for example, there's biases around pit bulls, and people could love pit bulls and have pets, and they could be super sweet and lovey, or people could say, based off of the bias that I have, based off of the perception that I have, I've categorized pit bulls. And I could say, this could be helpful to be able to learn and to understand things. And it could make me detect and make me recognize. So if I were to see a pit bull walking down the street, not on the leash, just in my neighborhood, I'd be like, I might stay away from that dog and I might not pet that dog, because my biases, my ability to perceive tells me that it could be dangerous. However, right, Banaji and Greenwald said that could be helpful, but the problem with that is it could also lead me in the wrong direction. It could also make me come to a faulty conclusion. That dog is nice as can be, but it's created this bias in me where it's like, I'm having this conclusion and this conclusion can be wrong, right? It's like, that's the idea they're saying there is, on one hand, it can be really helpful. right? Just like maybe that situation, like there's certain things to help us categorize it. I would say, you know what? In this certain situation, I'm going to categorize like maybe I learned what a good restaurant looks like in my head versus a bad restaurant looks in my head. And I'll be like, oh, well, if a restaurant is like a little dirty looking or, maybe like not as fancy looking, well, the food's probably not going to be good. Maybe I learned that once upon a time. And then I'm like, well, what's wrong with that? Well, I might miss out on a potential hole in the wall of a restaurant where they have like the best possible food, right? So on one hand, it could be helpful, right? It could be a way for me to categorize and understand and learn things. On the other hand, that kind of mindset can send me in the wrong direction, right? And that's what these writers are saying there. And it's kind of that same thing that DJ is saying. It's like the single story can be helpful, right? It teaches us things, but it's not the only story. It's not the only way that we can see something. And so this is paraphrasing practice, right? Like this is taking a writer's ideas and finding a way to put that writer's ideas or those writer's ideas into our own words. But we're still capturing the same idea that they're presenting, but we're doing it in our own way. Does anyone have any questions about this so far? So this is what we're going to just stop to share there. This is exactly what you're going to be doing for homework this week, right? So the first part is there's the reading that's assigned, right? Some additional reading in Trevor Noah's book, and then the blind spot reading. And then what you'll do is you'll take two passages that stand out to you, one from each reading, right? There has to be at least two different readings, and then take a passage and paraphrase that passage. So you'll take those ideas, pull an idea. You can see the section that I pulled is only a couple sentences long, right? It's not huge. And then be able to take that idea and present that idea into your own words. And so that's what you'll be working on this week, right? Is going through that reading and then finding those sections. Then next week, what we'll focus on in another mini lesson is being able to think about how we use the quotes or use the paraphrases to build body paragraphs, right? We'll talk about quote integration, which is like introducing a writer and a source, presenting the quote or the paraphrase, and then providing analysis behind that. But for today, for this week's work, it's not about what your opinion is on the quote that you presented or the paraphrase. It's just like, can I take this writer's ideas and put the ideas into my own words? So the writer's ideas don't change, right? It's just the wording around those ideas change. Yeah.
If let's say like in the last paraphrasing, there was a phrase like lead us astray that you felt that was the best way to kind of describe it, should you still put those words in quotations or try to look for another way to do it?
Yeah, you could put those words into quotations, right?
Okay.
If you're using that phrase, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you could, oh, go ahead, Chris.
I think like it'd be like we just did with our paraphrase. It's okay to use like a little bit of language that they were using in your paraphrase, as long as it's like distinct enough that you're still putting in your own words. Like if you find yourself paraphrasing and you're using like all the words of the quotation, then you should probably just quote it.
Right.
Because like if you like we said earlier, like if you can't say it better, then just use their words. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that lead us astray is a perfect example, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just those few words at the end where you could be like, this could quote lead us astray. And so like a lot of times there will be situations where, especially with like, really specific vocabulary, right? Or maybe like in Trevor Noah's book, for example, like he might use a term that we just don't have a way of paraphrasing, right? Like there's sections where he's maybe talking about something that's like cultural, or he'll use a section from like a different language or the name of something specific. And in that situation, there's just no way of paraphrasing that. You would use a mix of quote and of paraphrase. And that's also a really helpful thing to do, right? Because it's kind of like, there are those sections where it's like, I can make this clearer, but then there's that section where it's like, I just can't change this wording around. And that's when we do like this little kind of hybrid of quoting and paraphrasing. And that would work really well there.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So that's what you're going to be practicing through this week. And then if there's any questions as you're working, like just you can send us some emails, you can bounce some paraphrases off, submit them, and then we can shoot you some feedback.
Totally.